In this presentation, I will cover the main ideas in Barbara Johnson's article Writing that is published in 1990. First, who is Barbara Johnson? Barbara Johnson is an American critic. She is well known for translating French theory, mostly well known for her translation of Jacques Derrida's Dissemination. She is among the first voices who applied French theory to African American literature, and she is a student of Paul de Man, who is another proponent of Derridian deconstruction. Among her books, I will highlight three of the well-known books. A World of Difference in 1987 is a book that provides a deconstructive analysis of certain ideas and works. In 1994, she wrote The Wake of Deconstruction. Basically, it talks about what the theory awakened and what it stirred. The last book I have here as an example is her 1998 The Feminist Difference, where she argues that the strength in feminism is not in its unity, but in its difference. Now, the article that is the subject of this presentation is called Writing, and it was published in a book called Critical Terms for Literary Studies of the same year, of course, 1990. She begins the article by asking a question about her title. She asks whether writing is a critical term or just a medium for readers to meet words on readers and writers to meet through words on papers. So this is where she starts the article, and the gist of the article is really how the study of writing, or l'écriture, because she uses the French term specifically because she is drawing our attention to the theoretical revolution in France in the 1967. So the word l'écriture here, which is often used in theoretical discussions of this source, really just means writing. What she's asking, or what she's exposing here, is how this study of writing that was predominant in the 60s in France had an effect on literary study today, well, her day, the 1990s, the end of the 20th century. This type of study, the study of writing in French, is mostly known or exhibits itself mostly in a journal called Tel Quel, where writers such as Derrida and Barthes discuss elements, and in this case, writing becomes a main topic. All these writers who write in Tel Quel start from a Saussurean linguistics perspective. So the background, she elaborates on the background of this type of thinking, the discussion on writing or the study of writing, by giving us the history of the evolvement of the thoughts surrounding it. She starts with Saussure's course in general linguistics, which was published very early in the 20th century, republished again and again. And then she moves to talk about the influence of Barthes' writing degree zero in the 50s and 1950s. And finally, she moves to Derrida's three texts, three of which were published in the 1967. And from these three theories, she moves in this article to present her analysis of what these theories enabled. Again, the main idea of the article, the main idea of writing, is looking at how this study of writing, when it became a topic for study, a critical term, it affected the way we read literature today. It affected literary studies today, as of 1990s all the way till today. So I will start by presenting what she talked about when she mentioned Saussure. Again, this is early 20th century, and she is referring to his book course in general linguistics. Saussure brought a new look into the study of language. He started focusing on a synchronic type of study as opposed to the previous diachronic type of study. Synchronic is basically the structural type of studying language, as opposed to the older and previously established studies of language that were diachronic or historical. They look at the evolution of language. Saussure decided to look at language as it is today and how it works as a structure. That's why it's synchronous. It is now, not historical. Saussure in his study views language as a system governed by rules that define the relations between its terms, between the terms of the language. This happened also with other critics like Claude Lévi-Strauss, for example. These terms, or the terms of language, he sees that the sign or the sign system is language, but he calls it the sign system because he wants to distinguish the two components that make up language. Because we often think of language and we think of the words. He says this sign system or language is made of two components. It is made of the signified, which is the concept or the idea or even the mental image, and the signifier, which is very often the word, but it could also be a sketch or an image. So language here, by defining language as a sign system, he wants us to see that it is made of two components, a mental image and how we present this mental image, whether through writing or through paintings. And then he studies the relationship between these two, between the signified or the image in our head and the signifier, which is the word or the poem. He says the relationship between them is arbitrary, random. There is no reason why a pen is called a pen, a book is called a book, a table is called a table. The relationship between the signified or the mental image and the way we refer to it in language is arbitrary. He also says that the meaning of words or of the sign system is generated by difference. That is by its difference from neighboring signs. So for example, the difference between a house and a hut and a cottage, it is their difference from each other that gives us meaning. We understand that this is a house and not a cottage, not a hut, not a palace, not a castle. We understand it by looking at it. In this case, it's a relationship of size, but it's not always a relationship of size. Sometimes it's a relationship of usage. So the difference between pen, pencil, stylus, crayon, and so on. So the difference in the relationship of these items allow us to understand the meaning of these words or these signifiers. What this means is that it is the difference and not the identity or the similarity that is the origin of meaning. So meaning resides in difference. If you remember again, in the beginning I mentioned that the three books two of the three books that Barbara Johnson is known for use the word difference, A World of Difference and The Feminist Difference. Because what Saussure is telling us is that difference defines meaning, not similarity. From this study of language, or as a development of this study of language, we have Roland Barthes, who in the 50s started talking about language specifically in its relation to literature or text, written text. Literature, the use of literature here, when Barthes talks about literature, he's talking about what we refer to as the canon, the group of accepted or esteemed works of literature, not just any writing. And in the middle of the 20th century, when he is writing, when Barthes is writing, when Derrida and Barthes, and even before with Saussure's text, literature started being an important concept. It is taught in schools, there is a canon, it's established. So literature became a concept that is gaining in its importance at the same time when writing, which is how literature is presented, begins to be questionable in its ability to represent. Writing fails sometimes to represent, and Saussure was one of the earliest voices who talked about this. But the fact that in France in that time writing was becoming the topic of discussion means that at the same time that literature was gaining in fame, writing was now becoming questioned, or at least its representational qualities are becoming questioned. So what Barthes does to help us reach that line of thinking is distinguish between work or œuvre and text. A work is a book, published, written. It could be a book, it could be anything else at this point with the digital world, but a work is something that is complete as possible, whereas the text is what we read. So the text here relates to a more common word is textuality, which enables us to see what he means. He says there is a relationship between the two, but they are not the same. And he invites us to be aware of the distinction between work and text. Work is something complete, something that is finished, whereas text is always becoming. And this element of always becoming will be revisited later. There is this essence of always becoming. Meaning is always becoming. It is postponed. But we will get more into that when we come to Derrida. So again, the work, because it is complete, it is done, it does not open room for discussion. The text, because it's a process, it does open room for discussion and multiplicity of meanings. The quote I have selected here is a quote that distinguishes between work and text. Closure versus subversion. There's closure in a work because it is complete. There is subversion in text because the textuality of handling a text results in the subverting the previous reading or the previous analysis. Between product and practice, the work is the product. How do we practice this product? By reading it, by making it into a text. A meaning containing object, which is the word, the work. The work is an object that contains meaning, and the word contain here is important. Meaning resides in the object. That's with work. However, when we come to text, it is a process. It's a significance scattering process. So it's a process where the signification or the signified, the meaning, is scattered. It changes. It's not static. So this is the difference that he is highlighting, and Barthes is telling us to be aware, not to confuse a work with the text. That our reading of a work makes it into a text. The minute a work is opened, it becomes a text, and readers, not specifically you or me, but multiplicity of reader, communities of reader, give it life. Barthes, if you remember, is also known for the death of the author, and it relates to this concept. The author is dead because the author puts out a work. And once the work is put out, it is closed, it is a product, it is complete. What this work gives life to is textuality, or the reader now reading the text. So this is related to his concept of the death of the author. Now, this type of thinking is then developed further by Jacques Derrida, who's known for 3 of his works, Writing and Difference, of Grammatology, and Speech and Phenomena, all published in 1967. In his work, Derrida says that great books, or literature, if you remember what Barthes referred to it as literature, or the canon, that great books rebel against their own statements that speech is better than writing. So, to understand this concept, we will explain what this speech versus writing is in a bit. Speech is, in Western philosophy, idealized, as in it is seen as better than writing, because, and I will read the quote and then continue discussing what is written in the slide, because speech is seen as immediacy, presence, life, and identity, whereas writing is seen as deferment or postponement, absence, death, and difference. Because of that, Western philosophy, most philosophy really, but we're talking about Western philosophy here, thinks that speech is more honest, more truthful, and therefore better than writing, because speech is immediate. The person speaking is right there, whereas writing results in the transference or the translation of speech into words. That's where Derrida is coming to us with what I stated earlier, that the great books of literature make up statements that prove the opposite of what they intend to say. And what generally they intend to say is in line of Western philosophy, that speech is more valued than writing. This type of logic, this type of thinking is referred to as, in Western philosophy, as a logocentric thinking. Logocentric because it puts the logo, the speech, at the center of everything, as the main thing. Speech is the center, and writing becomes similar to a copy of the speech, or a manifestation of a speech, or a representation of the speech. Now, this relates to Saussure, but also relates to the very early study of Plato that we referred to in class, who analyzes the difference between the idea and its representation. If you remember in Plato's cave allegory, he says the people living in the cave are seeing representations or shadows of what exists outside. But this is an allegory because what Plato is telling us is not that there are things living outside the cave, but that what we see, that we are all more or less in a cave, and what we see are shadows or copies of ideas. There is an idea of something, but because an idea by its very nature it's a concept. Again, if you remember, Saussure talks about signified and signifier. The idea is a signified, it's a concept, it's a mental image. But we can't reach the mental image, so it's always translated as a physical thing. So the idea of a bed is not like the real bed, the idea of a table is not like the real table. And and because of that, Derrida is similar to Plato because he does also take from this Platonic thinking that the idea is always better than its physical manifestation, whether in word or image or carpentry or whatever it is, its manifestation on this world. Now, speech, Derrida tells us, is very much like writing. Even if the argument with Western philosophy that speech is better or more valued than writing, speech is structured like writing. And Derrida here brings up the term or makes up the term différance, which is not a real word. It's a combination of two words in French. It's a combination between different and deferral. Different is clear enough. Deferral is postponement. So he brings up the word différance to show how speech and writing is based on this différance. Both the difference, so meaning is reached by difference, but meaning is also reached by a deferral process. It is postponed. So if we use the same example of the difference between house, mansion, hut, cottage, to reach the meaning of house, if I tell you house, the meaning of house doesn't sit in house itself, it sits in its difference to other types of dwellings. And for you to reach this meaning, there's a process of deferral or postponement. So the meaning doesn't reside in the signifier. You reach the meaning that is in the signifier, in the word, by a process. And because it's a process, it is deferred, it is postponed. You don't get the meaning of pen until I can explain to you its difference from pencil, from stylus, from Sharpie, whatever it is. So, deference is an important term for Derrida because he's saying in speech and in writing there is deferral, there is postponement of meaning, and there is meaning that is based on difference. The meaning of A is based on its difference on B. So the meaning of A does not reside in A. Whether this is done in speech or writing, Derrida is telling us the meaning resides in difference. And again, difference is an important term here. In difference, Derrida also goes back to talking about how Western philosophy, in its logocentrism, but its other centricism, functions. For difference to make sense to you, you have to understand Derrida's analysis of how the world, at least in Western ways of thinking, is seen as a hierarchical binary. Binary means an opposites. We understand black because it's not white, good because it's not evil, present because it's not absent. But this relationship, this opposition, which he refers to as the binary, is not just an opposition. It's an opposition that elevates one over the other. So a hierarchical opposition. So in the opposition between, for example, good and evil, good is better. Presence and absence, presence is better. If you look at the terms in the quote here, immediacy, presence, life, and identity is often seen as better than deferment or postponement, absence, death, difference. Other such terms in the binary logic are very common with most of the theories we're discussing. The distinction between man and woman, black and white, or I'd rather say white and black, because white is on the higher level of the hierarchy, black is on the lower level of the hierarchy. Man versus woman, again, man resides on the higher level of the hierarchy, woman on the lower level of the hierarchy. Mind versus body, mind is higher, body is lower. reason versus passion, reason is higher, passion is lower. So, this binary mode of thinking, this hierarchical binary in which Western philosophy, um, uh, which Western philosophy depends on, results in such logocentric thinking where if we have speech on writing, which are different, naturally our mode of thinking, our ideological framework would necessitate that we put one as better than the other. And because of this, because of the need in Western philosophy to assign a good and a bad, speech was assigned as the better of writing. What Derrida is saying is that it is just like writing, it is also based on deferral. So every time a work of literature wants to prove, for example, that speech is better than writing, so that the presence of the speaker is better than hearing about the speaker, or the presence of the character in a scene where the character tells you, I did so and so, is better, as in you believe in it more than someone telling you. Now, writing here is not writing, it's still speech. But the transference, the translation of speech into writing weakens it. Again, this is Plato. The translation or the transference of an idea into an object weakens this idea. It is the object, and in Plato's analysis, it was the poem, because the poem is a representation of a feeling. Therefore, the poem fails because no representation is complete, because all representations have the ability or the problem of misrepresenting or not completely representing or showing you only one angle of an item. Representation always, according to Plato, and this is where Derrida is coming up with his thinking, because that's Western philosophy. Plato is the father of Western philosophy. Representation always loses something. In representing an item, you are either lying, it doesn't have to be an intentional lie, you are lying because you are hiding one part of it. If you paint a picture, it is just one front of the house, for example, you are painting. So representation is always, for Plato and by extension with Western philosophy, undervalued. The real thing is better than its representation. Now, in all these theoretical studies of signifiers and signified, or the structure of language, whether with Saussure, Barthes, and Derrida, there is often a direct relationship between this line of thinking, which is, we're talking about structuralism here, even as it evolves with Derrida into post-structuralism. Again, it's the same line of thinking, the focus on the structure of language. There is a relationship that Barbara Johnson draws between structuralism and Marxism, and also one between structuralism and psychoanalytic theory. So I will tease out the relationship for you here as much as possible. I will read the quote after I explain a little bit about this relationship. She says that the relationship between the signifier and the signified, which is a structural term, is similar to the relationship between materialism and idealism. And materialism and idealism are Marxist terms. Material, of course, is always a Marxist term. So, under Platonic thinking, which I was describing before, the signified is privileged. The idea, again, remember the relationship here in structuralism between signified and signifier. The signified is better because the signified is the concept, the idea, whereas the signifier is the representation of this idea. And for Platonic thinking, for Western thinking, the idea is better than its representation. So, in the same way that under structuralism, the signified or the concept is privileged or seen as better in the hierarchy, similarly, in Marxist thinking, the commodity is fetishized. The commodity is becomes similar to this manifestation of the signified into a signifier. So the commodity in Marxist thinking becomes, or the structure of the relationship between the commodity and the person who uses it becomes similar to the structure or the difference between signifier and signified. So what happens in this quote is Johnson is highlighting how structuralism and Marxism are related I will read the quote. The liberation of the signifier. Remember, the signifier is not liberated because the signifier is less than the signified. The word is less than the concept. So, the liberation of the signifier, the rebellion against idealist repressions, from the word idea, and the unleashing of the forces of difference and desire against the law, the unleashing of the forces of difference. Remember, again, this is what structuralism is telling us. It's telling us that words are based on their difference, not on their similarities or not their identity. So the unleashing of the forces of difference and of desire against the law and order of identity. If you remember, very early on, we explained how even as early as I presented you with the work of Barbara Johnson, the feminist difference, where she says the strength in feminism is in its difference, not in its identity. Identity here meaning similarity. So again, the unleashing of the forces of difference and desire against the law and order of identity were all part of the program for change that developed in France in the 1960s. And this is how structuralism and Marxism relate, because they both gave rise to this liberation of, I don't want to call it the oppressed because the signifier is not exactly the oppressed, but the less privileged. So, by the same way that the French theoretical revolution called for the liberation of the signifier, called for our attention to distinguish between, to use Barthes, work and text. Text is not worse than work, it's just different. Similarly, in Marxist thinking, this rebellion against repression, the repression of the signifier or the repression of the proletariat, is how the two theories work together and helped in the changes that happened in France in the 60s, specifically the theoretical changes that happened in France in the 60s, and that affected all the schools of theory that came after it, all the way to the beginning of the 21st century, or even till today. It's just the presence now is not as strong as it used to be. There is also a relationship that Johnson draws between structuralism and psychoanalysis. If you remember our study of psychoanalysis and Freud and Lacan, now she reminds us here that Lacan discovered that the unconscious is structured like language. Remember, Freud focused on the actual body. Lacan took this Freudian analysis and discussed the structure of what we do to be similar to the structure of language. So, the unconscious in psychoanalytic theory is a structure. It's not a place where our drives and energies exist only. There's a structure. There's something that makes them work. If you remember the mirror stage, the hiding of the ego, the id, the superego, all this means that the unconscious is it has a structure. And what happens is that our consciousness always attempts to ignore the signifiers that take place in the unconscious so that we can fit, so that we can control one's identity. We always tend to, again, in the analysis of egos, id, superego, the superego always wants to crush the id so that the ego appears as, as representable as possible. These signifiers that take place in our unconscious, signifiers, as in the dreams, for example, are signifiers. The slips of the tongue are signifiers. All these signifiers lead us to the meaning through a chain of signification. So I will read the first quote. Dreams, slips of the tongue, parapraxis, hysterical symptoms, and other expressions of the unconscious are, for Lacan, manifestations of a signifying chain, a structure of associations that resembles an unconscious foreign language. So these elements, these are the signifiers. This is what happens in our unconscious or in our dreams, which according to Freud is also a manifestation of our conscious. These elements are expressions of an unconscious, and you understand them when you put them in a chain, when you connect them. That's why psychoanalytic theory is known to have, the psychoanalyst or the psychologist would meet their patient and tell them to tell a story or a dream or a memory, and they connect these memories. This is the signifying chain, and by connecting these memories, these dreams, these slips of the tongue, the therapist finds meaning. And this is psychoanalytic theory. But this connection of meaning, this is linguistics. This is structuralist theory. The connection of meaning, the only difference is that the meaning here is not the meaning we find in words, but the meaning we find in dreams and in slips of the tongue, in all these expressions that are not typical or easy to reach. What a therapist does is looks at this chain of signification, or the signifying chain, and connects it to reach meaning. Again, if you remember Derrida telling us that meaning is always deferred, that you have to connect pen to pencil to stylus to reach the meaning. It's similar here, and the connection that she is drawing is intentional between structuralism and psychoanalytic theory. They both argue that to reach meaning, whether the meaning of why character X did what they did, or the meaning of a sentence, you have to employ this signifying chain. You have to connect different signifiers, different levels of expressions to reach the meaning. Again, goes back to the beginning. Meaning does not reside in the object. Meaning takes place when you are able to connect different signifiers, different dreams, different slips of the tongues, different memories. You connect them as a therapist or as a linguist in order to reach meaning. These dream slips of the tongue, they might be secondary. We might think of them as hidden or unintentional. But according to Freudian and Lacanian according to psychoanalytic theory, they are not insignificant. They are significant. The second quote explains this. Just as Freud rendered dreams and slips of the tongue readable rather than dismissing them as mere nonsense or error. So that's Freud. That's psychoanalytic theory. They look at dreams and slips. They're not just slips of the tongue. They're not mistakes. We actually call them Freudian slips. They're not slips of the tongue. They have a meaning. So just as Freud looked at these as readable rather than errors or mistakes, so Derrida sees signifying force in the gaps, the margins, figures, echoes, digressions, discontinuities, contradictions, and ambiguities of the text. So dreams, slips of the tongue resemble, in psychoanalytic theory, in therapy, resemble in text, in literature, for our sake at least, when you have a gap in the meaning, when you have an echo of something, when you digress, when the narrator or the character digresses, when the story is not continued, when there is a contradiction, when there is an ambiguity. All these things are, for structuralist theories or theorists, the connection. These things are not mistakes. They are not gaps. It's not something that the writer forgot. It doesn't matter about the intention. We're not talking about the intention. They are not things forgotten or mistakes. They actually have meaning in them. So meaning found in these gaps and ambiguities. To demonstrate this line of thinking, the focus on language and the importance of language beyond saying it is made of a sign system that is combined of signifier and signified, beyond saying that the relationship between them is arbitrary and that there is difference between the work that's written and the work that is read, and beyond what Derrida is talking about in terms of difference, or how meaning is reached by an element of postponement, and how that means that speech and writing one is not better than the other. What Johnson does, and what she does in most of her books, is uses this line of thinking to analyze literature. In analyzing literature, she does exactly what Derrida started by. When I presented you with Derrida, I told you that he looks at how great books or literature rebels against its own statement. So what a deconstructive writer does, or critic does, is exactly that. Takes out a work of literature and proves how this work of literature rebels against its own meaning. So the work of literature wants to say this, but in analyzing that work of literature, you discover that it's digressing, or it's going against what it intends to say. The example she uses is a poem by Edward Taylor called Meditation 6. I will read it briefly and then explain a little bit how this is used. Am I thy gold, or purse, Lord, for thy wealth? whether in mine or mint refined for thee. I'm counted so, but count me over thyself, lest gold washed face and brass in heart I be. I fear my touchstone touches when I try me and my counted gold too overly. Am I new minted by thy stamp indeed? Mine eyes are dim, I cannot clearly see. Be thou my spectacles that I may read thine image and inscription stamped on me. If thy bright image do upon me stand, I am a golden angel in thy hand. Lord, make my soul thy plate, thine image bright within the circle of the same enfile, and on its brims in golden letters write thy superscription in an holy style. Then I shall be thy money, thou my ord. Let me thy angel be thou my Lord. Now, by its title, Meditation, the poem intends to bridge the gap between human and God. You meditate to reach God. So the poem intends to show or to decrease the gap between human and divine very early on by showing human value using divine measures. Again, am I thy gold? Am I the human, the gold of you, God? So this is how the connection between the divine and the human. What is the relationship the persona is asking between me and God? But in attempting to decrease this difference between God and human, each stanza moves further away in expanding or widening the difference. The meaning becomes postponed. So, whereas in the beginning it is something tangible and you can hold, gold is something you can hold. Gold is then transferred to, if you look at the purple highlights, to show an example of how the connection between, well, divine and human moves and becomes less easy to grasp. So first it is gold. Am I thy gold means I am something that you can hold. So something physical. By the second stanza, it becomes, am I also thine image? Am I your image? So it's not gold anymore. It's not something physical that you can touch. It's an image, which is still, you can see it, but it's not something you can touch. And finally, you become letters, not even an image, just words. And if we look at any study of representation, if we go back to Plato, letters or words about gold are less valuable, less truthful, less honest than gold itself. So gold is there, its presence, it's strong, you can touch it, whereas letters are things written. So the distancing that happens between the connection between man and God, from man being seen as something that you can hold, it doesn't matter that it's gold, I'm not talking about the precious stone, just something you can hold, to something you read. But this change continues. If you notice how in the first stanza, the persona says, I'm counted, count me. There is again, not only is gold touchable, there's the element of something countable. You can count it, you can give value to it. So I am counted so, but count me over yourself. There's an element of counting. But by the second stanza, mine eyes are dim, I cannot clearly see. So not only can't I count, the persona is asking God to be his spectacles, his glasses, so that he can read thine image. So in the first stanza, there's an element of countability, numbers, value. The second stanza, that becomes even less tangible, that you need someone to help you see the image, that you may be able to read or understand the image. And by the last stanza, you're not even there, because the last stanza is saying, make my soul thy plate, so and so, then I shall be thy money. I'm not even there yet. So by the last stanza, human or persona at least is not close to God yet. He's saying, do this so that I can be thy money, I can be close to you. And the third example of the distancing from God or from the divine is how it's similar to the first one. How the first stanza talks about something touchable, even the words used, touches. I fear my touchstone touches when I try. The second stanza, this touching changes into an inscription, so something written, something already written or even sketched, an inscription. And then by the last stanza, it's not even there. It's not even written yet because he is trying to write it. He said, "Let me or help me write." So from metal to image to letters, from touching to reading to writing, from counted to almost read because there's a spectacle to not yet written. The speaker here, by the end of the stanza, seems to be farther away from the connection with God than he is in the beginning. So a poem that intends to show meditation as a way to reach God distance the speaker from this God. These inscriptions, the images and spectacles, are supplements. A supplement is another Derridan word. A supplement is something that is both an addition and a substitute. Supplement with an E, it's another French term. So these, the image, the spectacles, they replace something. Because the something, the touch with the divine cannot be reached. So, as with all poetry, when we talk about metaphors are similar, we supplement because the speaker, I cannot be close to God. I supplement or change or substitute my closeness with things like an image and an inscription that is seen in the second and third stanza. Now, what this reading does is exactly what Derrida and the previous post-structuralist critics are talking about. It argues how writing has an intention. Again, we are not talking about the intention of the author, we're talking about the intention of the text. But in analyzing it, because writing, if you remember, is a concept. This is the whole gist of the article, that writing is something to discuss. Writing is something to analyze. And what Johnson analyzed here is that writing, specifically in this poem, is a matter of difference. It is a matter of meaning being found and being lost and being changed. Meaning does not reside and it's not fixed in the text. Meaning is always deferred or distanced or away from us. Because Western philosophy is also a philosophy that believes in the ability of man, humanity, to decipher, to understand. Logic is a main component of Western philosophy. Deconstructive thinking is making us doubt our ability to do logic, our ability to understand. If the language, our main strength to make meaning, fails us, then the whole premise of Western metaphysics or Western modes of thinking, science, technology, becomes questionable. Now, how does that figure for Barbara Johnson, who is, after all, a French feminist? Even if she's grouped here under deconstruction, deconstruction is a skeleton theory where any other theory can be grouped under it. She uses this analysis again to go back to Derrida, talking about logocentrism, speech as the center. And she goes back to Derrida also talking about the binary oppositions. In Derrida's binary opposition, there is always the good and the bad, the man and the woman. So for her, logocentrism, because if Western metaphysics values logocentrism, and if Western metaphysics values male over female, then logocentrism is male. So what Johnson and other similar feminist writers do, or French feminist writers do, is try to present a type of writing or speech that is not logocentric. It is called l'écriture féminine, or feminine writing. Not that it's only done by women, but this is a term used to distinguish between masculine writing that depends on the binary oppositions, that depends on white being better than black, man being better than woman. So for us to understand, when you go into a dark room, you already anticipate something bad. A simple line as, she went into a dark room, you anticipate something bad because dark is not good. Whereupon something like, he opened the window and the sunlight shone through the window, That's an image of hope because we associate the sunlight or light or brightness with goodness. So, this oppositional thinking helps us understand. So, the writer doesn't tell you she walked into a dark room and she was gloomy. You already associate that with gloom. So, we already associate good words with goodness, bad words with badness, whatever that is. What Écriture Feminine tries to do is develop a style of writing that they refer to as feminine because it is not male, because logocentrism is male, because it depends on a binary mode of thinking. So, l'écriture feminine is a type of thinking that tries to move away from this binary mode of thinking where A is good and B is bad, and everything that is like A is good, everything that is like B is bad. So this line of thinking, l'écriture féminine, is why she's bringing why Johnson relates writing, and she says this is the importance of writing for literary theory because it made us understand what writing is and the capabilities of writing. So by the end of her essay, she explains écriture féminine as a mode of writing that a lot of French feminists are using. I have examples of them here, Hélène Cixous and Luce Ergueray. They try to move away from masculine writing. That's the definition of masculine writing is all over, it's everything. By looking at the relationship between writing and the body. But this is just one type of écriture féminine. This is the most dominant type of écriture féminine, is a type of writing that wants to connect writing with the female body so that it becomes less masculine, because logocentrism, Western philosophy, is masculine. So how do I move writing away from a masculine domain? They attempt to connect it to the female body. So we have Hélène Cixous, for example, in one of her articles, The Laugh of the Medusa, she invites women to write with white ink. Whatever that means, the ambiguity of meaning is part of it. Write in white ink, which is Hélène Cixous' call, is write, first of all, it's white. You can't see it. But it also relates to the mother's milk, the nursing mother's milk. So that's what Luce Ergueray and Hélène Cixous and other writers we refer to as French feminists, that's where their ideas come from. Johnson paved the way, or she drew from their analysis, so that many feminists now on both sides, whether French or even the American and European, they're interested in the gender implications of the relations between writing as male, writing as female. Also between writing and silence, because if writing is masculine, then lack of writing is feminine. Silence is very often associated with women, therefore they take that as a discussion. Writing is speaking, silence is not speaking. Therefore, if we look at the binary, the way Western philosophy think, writing is masculine, silence is therefore feminine. Therefore, for example, French feminists value silence. They don't think that silence is negative because silence is feminine. It is the opposite of speech, but it is not negative. So I hope this was clear enough in bridging the gap between the different theories that or theorists that Johnson is illustrating as a background to reaching this final point. She gives you the history of Saussure, followed by Barthes, followed by Derrida. She also explains the link, because these are not just linguistic studies, because they affect our way of thinking in Marxist ideology and in psychoanalytic ideology. And then finally she reaches the last point where this line of thinking, the analysis of writing becoming a topic of discussion, has enabled l'écriture féminine.